Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and the many of you who are following us online. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I am the director of the Latin America program here at the Wilson Center in Washington. I'm thrilled to be hosting today's discussion. There are many threats to democracy in the Americas these days. In a region once widely regarded as a success story for transitions to democracy, there are now 3 established dictatorships. In many other countries, journalists and civil society groups operate under unprecedented pressure. Criminal organizations have subcontracted criminal justice institutions. To choose the leaders responsible for addressing these and other pressing challenges, most of the region still routinely holds reasonably free and fair elections. But perhaps the most troubling threat to democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean today is the plummeting trust in those elections. Indeed, according to the Americas Barometer survey, under 40% of Latin Americans still trust the elections that put their leaders in power. Of course, a free and fair election that is widely regarded as credible is not the only ingredient for a successful, enduring democracy, but it is a necessary one. Without it, leaders take office without the broad public support and legitimacy needed to govern in this era of high polarization and enormous governance challenges. So what's going wrong? The factors undermining public trust in elections in this region are diverse. They include, among other issues, broad skepticism about nearly every public institution, disinformation, a threat that is being made much more serious by artificial intelligence, problematic systems of campaign finance rules and laws and inadequate enforcement, and mistrust of electoral technologies. Through research and public events, such as today's conversation, we plan to address all of these issues as part of an important new Wilson Center initiative, restoring confidence in elections in Latin America. Today we'll tackle one of these challenges, inadequate and inconsistent support and funding for electoral observation. When it works, electoral observation, fully staffed, deployed early and unrestricted, deters electoral fraud, reassures voters, and provides guidance for improving electoral administration. I had the opportunity to participate in the observation of Mexico's recent election, visiting polling centers throughout Mexico City. There, in an enormously complex election, reliable results were produced and set the tone for an orderly transition of power that will conclude in the inauguration this Tuesday. In extreme cases, such as Guatemala last year, electoral observers can help thwart efforts to overturn an opposition victory. We'll discuss that case in greater detail today, including the role that the United States and the Organization of American States played in those days. And I see that Ambassador McFarland, Stephen McFarland, our former U.S. ambassador to Guatemala, joins us today. Welcome. In many other situations, unfortunately, too little money, too little political will, too little regional pressure, and too much reliance on the United States means electoral observers are not present, or at least not in sufficient numbers, or with a strong enough mandate, or with sufficient time. The most notorious recent case, of course, was in Venezuela in July. There, the limited electoral observation there was consequential. The Carter Center and United Nations post-election statements provided critical independent assessments that helped governments evaluate the deeply flawed election process. But it was clearly not enough to stop the Venezuelan regime from falsely claiming victory and preparing for a third term for Nicolás Maduro in January. To discuss the importance of electoral observation and opportunities to expand it in this region, I'm joined today by stellar experts. They include, to my left, the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States, Frank Mora. Welcome. Catherine Elena, Vice President for Programs at IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Welcome. And Francisco Guerrero, the OAS Secretary for Strengthening Democracy, who participated in a dinner we held last year in Miami to recognize the OAS and the European Union's role in supporting democracy in Guatemala. Thank you for that, and thank you for being here. I want to start, if I could, Ambassador, with you, talking about how the U.S. government views electoral observation, why it has been a priority and frequently funded almost exclusively by the United States, and where structural barriers have maybe inhibited the U.S. from guaranteeing electoral observation in the quality and consistency that I described earlier.
Thank you, Ben. Good to be with you and to talk about this very important issue. I think the first thing I want to say, and I say this often, is that the work that Secretary Guerrero and Director Icaza, who's here with us, I knew it was important before I arrived at the OAS. I knew the contributions that it made, but I really underestimated the impact that it was having. I mean, this is really the gold standard for electoral observation in the Western Hemisphere, period. And as you indicated, you know, elections is not everything. Elections are not where democracy begins and ends, but it certainly begins, and if you don't have or perceive to have a free and fair election, then the rest falls apart. And what the Secretary Guerrero's team does, in a sense, ensures that that country's at least first few steps is and the road to democracy, or the maintenance of democracy, is respected. And so the extraordinary dedication that his team does is something that I think is often underestimated, not by you, Ben, of course, but by many people. In terms of the United States, as a result, and in light of the challenges to democracy and the challenges to the trust and legitimacy of institutions, including electoral institutions, we have and we are committed, and we reaffirm our commitment to supporting in every way we can, politically and financially, the work of the Electoral Observation Mission. We support, you said 100%. We don't support 100%, but we support between 50 and 60% of all electoral observation missions in the country, in the region. Just to give you a number, since January of 2023 to date, till today, or a few weeks from now when the Brazilians have their municipal elections, there have been 20 elections at all levels, national, legislative, or municipal. We have provided over $5.2 million to the Secretariat over a period of 20 elections in a year and a half, right? But in addition to that, and I know this is not strictly electoral observation mission, but other ways in which the OAS is playing an important role, you mentioned this in the OAS. After the election in Guatemala, after these gentlemen did the extraordinary work they did in a very challenging environment, the OAS continued to stay engaged. So during the 6-month transition, right, there was a mission, an accompanying mission, I believe they called, right? Yep. That we also supported, that was led by the Secretary General, joined by former U.S. Ambassador Liliana Ayalde and former Panamanian Vice President and Foreign Minister Isabel Samalo, who were there sort of monthly following a very delicate process where there were clearly efforts to prevent Bernardo Arévalo from coming to office. And now today, since the election, Bernardo Arévalo came to the OAS, recognized the incredible work and contribution that the OAS had made. In fact, he said, "I doubt that I would have been able to be president if not for the OAS." That was in his speech. He made another request from us. There are currently an election for judges, Supreme Court judges and appellate judges, and he asked for something quite novel, which is not an electoral mission, a judicial mission to observe the election of judges that need to be decided by the 13th of October. The United States supported, and the OAS got involved, and there's a 3-person team of distinguished jurists and lawyers who are now observing that. So it's not just about the election, however important that is. The case of Guatemala and a few other places demonstrates that we, the OAS, remain seized by the crisis, institutional crisis, democracy in the region, and that either through the Inter-American Democratic Charter or other mechanisms, we do a lot of work in this space, and the United States not only supports this politically, but as I indicated, financially as well.
Excellent, and we hosted President Arévalo here on this stage during that very complicated transition period, and at that moment as well, he was very aware of the role the United States and the OAS were playing in assuring that the electoral result was honored. And I think we'll get into maybe some other details of the lessons learned from that, but it seems a very compelling case to point to in making this broader argument in favor of consistent and robustly funded electoral observation. Catherine, maybe if we could step back a little, IFES, and you could describe a bit of its global work and the scale of its electoral observation, but is the institution with the most expertise and on-the-ground experience in this region, I think, working on these issues alongside the OAS. I'd love for you to describe a little bit of the mechanics of how an electoral observation works, when it works most effectively, when it arrives, what its objectives are, how long it stays, and what it can achieve, just so we ground this theory a little bit in what the practice is on the ground.
Sure. And firstly, thank you so much for having me to be part of this panel at the Wilson Center. I noted that I'm the only person without PhD against my name, so hopefully I've been around elections for enough years to justify being part of this panel, but very much appreciate being
Probably
here.
More relevant knowledge than anything we got in school.
So firstly, I think just to acknowledge and echo the comments made by Ambassador Mora in terms of the value of observation. So for those who are not aware of IFES, we have been around almost 40 years working on electoral integrity around the world and including in this particular region. Election observation is something is part of our role. It's sometimes not the core of our role. We work a lot and primarily with the institutions that are running or managing elections. Traditionally, of course, that's been the body that is managing the election itself. But over time, I think as the electoral environment has become more complex, that's expanded out to different types of institutions, including something I think we'll touch on, the role of the judiciary in elections. So often in a country, and I think Guatemala is one example, IFES will be present helping to strengthen the institutions and the process itself. And we love it when our friends and colleagues from the OAS come into the country, even though in a sense they are judging some of our work in terms of how well the electoral process is playing out. It is a critical other piece of ensuring electoral integrity. And it's really important for what we're doing to be able to work closely with observation missions, and I've seen many of my friends in countries in the region, to be able to help them assess the electoral process, the institutions, against very clear international principles. And I think one important thing that maybe we will dive into here is, of course, observation is not just about what's unfolding on election day and the results process, although that's fundamental, and we've seen some real challenges around that in Guatemala and Venezuela. But it has evolved over time into very technical monitoring of core vulnerabilities in the electoral process. So you mentioned observation of the judicial process or how electoral justice is dealt with by the courts. I mean, that I think has become fundamental, particularly in this region, but not solely to this region. We've certainly seen a lot of judicialization of elections across the African continent as well. Other key areas, for example, would be political financing and the misuse of state resources. Something that we looked at recently is cryptocurrency and political finance in El Salvador. How do you track donations, contributions from cryptocurrency? And when you bring all those things back to electoral integrity, which essentially is the focus of observation, what it is there for is to give citizens confidence in the actual legitimacy of the electoral process and the institution, but also the perceived legitimacy of the process, because it's often that perception that these days is coming under attack. So for IFES, when we look at or consider electoral integrity, we look at, I think, three risk factors. One would be actual fraud in the electoral process. Sometimes that can take place leading up to or perhaps during an election, but of course, as we all know, it's often used just as a claim that perhaps fraud is there or existing in the electoral process to undermine trust. Observers help to break that down and detect whether that type of fraudulent behavior might be going on. The second risk or dynamic that it's very important to look at is systemic manipulation. And what I mean by that is manipulating the rules of the game, the laws, the institutions to sort of tip the election in the favor of a particular candidate, often the incumbent. And again, electoral observers are not just there looking at what's unfolding on election day. They come in very far in advance, usually doing an assessment process well in advance and looking at the legal framework and some of the behaviours and potential systemic manipulation that might be going on. And then lastly, the third risk factor is malpractice or negligence. Now, this is sort of just mistakes by election officials. I was also in Mexico for the elections, and I think we all saw a various number of mistakes, but they don't necessarily impact the process or the outcome, right? They are something to observe and they are something to improve. But it's important for observers to be there and say, you know what, there was some malpractice, there was some mistakes, but it wasn't fraud and it shouldn't be called as such to undermine the process itself. So I think the role of observers are so fundamental, obviously not just on election day around that period, but really monitoring the entire electoral cycle and those three risk factors or vulnerabilities that impact how people are going to perceive the process, the institutions, and the result.
Thank you, Catherine. Francisco, I think the case we just heard from Ambassador Mora, from Catherine, about the importance of electoral observation is pretty compelling, at least to me. It sounds useful, and increasingly so for a lot of the reasons we just heard, challenges to the integrity of elections that we didn't see in previous eras, a lot of public skepticism, some based on real problems, some of them based on perceptions. And yet, observation is not universal in the Americas yet. And the OAS, which is well known for doing this and doing this so effectively, isn't present at every election in the region. My question is, why not? Are these financial issues? Does it have to do with the concentration of funding that comes over 50% from the United States? Does it have to do with political will of governments themselves? What are the factors that determine whether the OAS is present in an election in Latin America?
Well, thank you, Benjamin, for having me. It's also my pleasure to be with mi tocayo, Francisco, with Catherine. Electoral observation is very much based on the democratic charter. And the countries who invite us, we have to be invited, by the way. If you don't receive an invitation from the member state, you cannot go there. You cannot go just because you want to go. That's why we were not in Venezuela, for example. Mm-hmm. And it's very much related to the political will of the states to have an election program like the one that we have. And let me tell you that when Francisco Mora was referring to what he thought prior to becoming the ambassador, when he was an academic or he was working in the government prior to that, the same happened to me in a way. And I'm going to explain this because I think it goes to your question. I was, in my other life, I was an electoral counselor in Mexico, in IFE. Mm-hmm. It was called IFE at that time. I was there from 2008 to 2013. I met Gerardo around 2012 or 11 because we were together for a little while. And as a member of an electoral institution, you think of the OAS, you think of electoral observation, and you say, well, it could be interesting. But when I came here, and I had been an electoral observer thanks to Gerardo's invitation, and I had been observer through other institutions, I didn't realize how important it is for the states to have electoral observation. And fortunately, in these, let's say, 10 years, because I've been together with Gerardo and Secretary Almagro, it's going to be 10 years next year, we were very lucky to bring together some countries who were not part of the program. The United States, Brazil, and of course, we have had very interesting elections in Brazil and the US in recent times. There are some countries who perhaps do not think that electoral observation is that important because they feel that their political system is strong enough. And I'm going to give you, for example, the example of Argentina, the example of Uruguay. Secretary Almagro is from Uruguay, and we don't have electoral observations in Uruguay. And in some cases, you can understand that because of political tradition or institutional strength, they don't invite us. But I think that when they see the value of observation, not only in terms of legitimacy and saying if there was fraud or not, and you go to the part that nobody knows about electoral observation, which is the recommendations. All the technical recommendations that we put forward are extremely important because they help you out to become a better electoral institution. So when you realize that that's a possibility, many countries tend to join the program. I just have a few numbers that I wanted to share with you just to see how electoral observation has evolved in the last decades. And the numbers are fantastic. I'm very proud of talking about this. I'm going to put my glasses, otherwise I won't see it well. From 1962 to 1982, we had 19 electoral observation missions. From 84 to 94, 30. From 95 to 2004, 68. From 2005 to 2014, 88. And in our period, Gerardo and myself, 2015 to 2024, 122. So this is what it's telling us is that the international communities in the Americas, they understood properly that to have a good election, you need electoral observation missions. What happens when you don't have an electoral observation mission? Venezuela is a good example. If we had been there, of course, difficult to be there in these circumstances, and I'm telling you this because I was an electoral observer twice in Venezuela prior to arriving to the OAS. Electoral observation is a very powerful tool. So to answer your question more precisely, I think that the political will is there. 28 out of 34 is not so bad. We still need another countries to join in. Gerardo and myself keep working with those governments in order to invite them to join the program. And I guess that when we have these countries, all the countries together, we will have more political energy and political strength. But nowadays, it's a part of the political culture of the continent, and I think in general, states know that for them it's important to have us there. Because there's another thing, and I'm gonna finish with this. Electoral observation is evolving. When I arrived to the OAS in 2015, we used to go there. We had, the budget is always a problem. I don't wanna cry about it, but money is always a problem. But from the experiences from, let's say, 2015 to 2020, things have changed a lot. And now the nature of the missions have changed also. They always demand, many countries demand, could you stay for another 2 weeks? Could you stay for a month? And the case of Guatemala is the best example. Thanks to Frank, we were able to challenge that.
Maybe I could press you to complain just a little about the funding, because if that is a serious barrier to the amount of time you can spend, to the number of elections you can observe, then I think it is something worthy of our consideration. So again, I give you permission, and I insist maybe just talk a little bit about the financing part of this, and IFES maybe you can
You have to take into consideration that almost all the DECO team is here. They came, and I appreciate that they came because they're very much interested in what's happening, particularly in terms of financing. I'm going to give you one example of how we are situated now.
Please.
The European Union has 10 times more money than us. So when you compare the mission that we had in Guatemala with the European Union mission, Gerardo is 10 times cheaper than the one in the European Union.
I always thought.
Not cheaper in the way that he's cheap, no. Efficient. It's 10 times more efficient.
Sure.
For example, our observers, they travel by themselves with a driver sometimes. Well, no, not sometimes. All the time with a driver. But for example, in the case of the European Union, they go by couples, which is always good because elections are becoming more dangerous. It's more sophisticated, the job. So in that sense, I think that speaks of the lack of commitment sometimes of countries, that they are extremely happy when they receive the mission. Because I guess everybody knows that our missions, differently to other missions, we don't receive a penny from the country in which we're going to. So we're independent, we're autonomous, we are very much in charge of the political decisions that we take there, the technical decisions that we take there. But that's something that has to be taken into consideration. The other thing, and you said that it's okay to complain, and since Frank Morris is here, so the countries are represented, the problem that we're facing every time is that since we have to stay more time in the country, Gerardo budgets a project for staying for a week, and then I tell him, Gerardo, I have bad news. You have to stay there, and you have to stay there for another week or for 15 days. So that's the evolving, the change in the evolution of the program, that I guess that now that we finish our term with Mr. Almagro in 2025, I would think and I would wish that the next Secretary General understands properly, as Frank just explained, the relevance and importance of the program. This program, if we were McDonald's, this is the Big Mac of McDonald's. I mean, this is the product. So we have to work very hard in order to have a good product, to increase the quality of the product. I could love, for example, that Gerardo could have more resources, also not only for the observation, but for accompanying other political processes that unfortunately sometimes is complicated. In some countries, we do it, as we did in Guatemala. The mission that just Frank Moore explained is still working, but it's not the trend. Money is always very scarce, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, we're going to turn to Ambassador Moore to talk about the Venezuela case in just a moment. But while talking about budgets, I did want to just turn to you, Catherine, to talk very briefly about your funding model and how much, again, funding is a barrier, if it is at all, to the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree.
Permission to complain as well for you.
You can complain as well.
Excellent. I think I would touch on sort of 3 additional points to what Francisco has pointed out here. And for us, I think one of the big challenges is the timing of funding, and perhaps slightly different to the OAS. IFAS is part of a consortium with the International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute, as CEPS is our consortium. And together we work on sort of electoral integrity across the region, including these election observation missions. And for all of this work, one of the biggest challenges is the timing of when the funding comes. And of course, when there are policy decisions behind that, the funding is going to come sort of right ahead of an election where attention has turned to the election and the potential outcome. But in reality, the funding to be able to look at electoral integrity more holistically needs to come much further in advance and sort of be following the electoral cycle rather than sort of immediately before election day. So I'd say that's one key thing. The other piece is the very important point that was made about recommendations. I mean, those are critical, and the recommendations coming out of election observation missions and reports are what have to be used immediately after an election to start improving the system and the process then, well ahead of the next election, including, for example, around legal frameworks where there might be challenges. The second piece is the role of national observers and citizen observers, and international election observation missions have such an important role to be working with, empowering, informing these national citizen observers on the ground. Of course, that's more money, right? But it's a legacy that you're leaving behind and an extra layer of transparency that you're bringing to the electoral process. And of course, there were many brave citizen observers in Venezuela this election, some of whom have had to flee the country. But that funding, again, can be a challenge on top of the funding for the international election observation. And I will say they both really need to go together because the international community has such a strong voice in pointing out challenges to the election, but then you also have these brave folks on the ground who can really cover the country and be identifying some of the challenges and following, of course, the tally of results. And then lastly, and it relates to timing, but the comment I made earlier about monitoring of some of these technical processes. I mean, in some countries, you'll have the judicial process playing out over quite a long period of time, and being able to fund a process of attending court and analysing how these cases are being decided and playing out. Again, you're adding more expense, of course, to the process, but it's still just such a critical component for to have transparency over.
So, Ambassador Moore, I'm glad we started by talking about a successful case. I think we focus often on things going wrong, and that was the success of electoral observation, both by the EU and the OAS with support from the United States and Guatemala. both during the election and during this very complicated period, very long period until the inauguration. I do want to turn to more, let's say, a more problematic example, which was Venezuela in July. There, leading up to the election, I think we should recognize there was success. There was an opposition primary that took place. The election did occur. There were candidates disqualified, but ultimately there was unity in the opposition around Edmundo Gonzalez, who we hosted in the days before the election in a virtual conversation here at the Wilson Center. But the election observation piece didn't meet, I think, the expectations that the United States and others had leading up to it. I would love to just hear a bit from you, maybe historically now, why that was. What went wrong with the plans for the EU? We heard that the OAS simply wasn't invited. What was the capacity that the Carter Center and the United Nations had in observing the election with what limited time and budget and authority they were given? And what does it mean now as we try to make sense of what did occur and what it's possible between now and January in having what appears to be an opposition victory honored before the next inauguration?
So you're right. It was clear that Maduro was not interested in having a robust electoral observation presence, did not invite the OAS. The United Nations, I'm sorry, not the EU was planning on going, and at near the end or close to the day of the election, Maduro decided that no, that for reasons having to do with sanctions, that they were not to be invited. So there was a limited presence. You mentioned the Carter Center, who had a small presence, but I think an important one. And you've heard the statement that Jenny Lincoln and others from the Carter Center have made in the subsequent days of the election. What's interesting to me, right, is that despite the fact that there was no robust presence, at the end of the day, Maduro felt that he could not accept the results of an election in which there were very few observations, and it wasn't a particularly democratic climate. And with all that, despite all that, there was an election, as you indicated, and it turned out that the election would, for the most part, seemed pretty legitimate, and it gave the results that perhaps Maduro wasn't expected, but that I think many people thought, and at the last minute decided that was not going to accept the results, and that the CNE, the Electoral Council, that clearly had been controlled by Maduro, decided not to publish the tallies, the actas, and we're still waiting for those, right? And they had the Supreme Court then unconstitutionally rule that Maduro was elected the next president, which they did not have the authority to do so. So that's an interesting case to me, Ben, where there was no strong electoral presence, although the international community was paying quite a bit of attention to the election there, and that at the end it turned out in ways that the Maduro and the authorities couldn't accept, and decided to brazenly simply say to its own people, to the international community, and everyone else, we're not gonna play by these. We're not gonna accept the results, and we are where we are. I just want to say something about Venezuela and the OAS. The OAS finds itself in we have to admit, a kind of polarized environment, right? It reflects the region in many ways. And that's why, so when we hear stories like what we did with Guatemala, for example, where there was consensus around everything we did around that election and subsequent situation. But in Venezuela as well, right? We came together, and by consensus, we adopted a strong resolution on the issue of the election and human rights, when many people thought that the OAS could not do that. And we are committed to remaining seized by the situation in Venezuela. Next week, there's going to be another permanent council meeting. We're going to take up the issue of Venezuela, right? And we're going to keep highlighting and calling attention, because the international community has an obligation to do so, it seems to me, in support of the people of Venezuela, and that the will of the Venezuelan people be respected. And so we, the international community, have an important role, maybe not the principal role, but certainly an important role in demonstrating that. And this week we saw at the United Nations, Secretary Blinken had meetings with dozens of counterparts, and you may have heard, he said, you know, it's now, we have to now move beyond declarations and statements and do something really substantive about the situation in Venezuela.
So what might that be? I mean, I must say there's a great deal of hopelessness now in addressing Venezuela, just as there was, I think, momentum and enthusiasm leading into the election and with the apparent opposition victory. Now I think there's a sense that the mediation going on within the region, led by Colombia and Brazil, seems to have petered out or certainly not produced results so far. The human rights conditions are atrocious and getting worse every day. And we're now in this period where, by all accounts, the authoritarian government in Venezuela is preparing for a third term. So, you know, where is there hope? What might new actions look like from the United States and its partners in the region and globally? What role might the UN and might the OAS have going forward?
Well, none of this is easy, right, Ben? That's the first thing, right? And the OAS has limited tools beyond the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is that it invoked on several occasions with respect to Venezuela. We just don't have the tools to continue pressuring other than what we've done so far. But because it's difficult and complex, doesn't mean we should just kind of live with the status quo. It would be a mistake to surrender to frustration. It would be a mistake to surrender to the strategy that Maduro has of just waiting us out. This could take months, it could take longer than that, but we have to be persistent. But more importantly, we have to do this in support of the Venezuelan people and the democratic forces within Venezuela. They are the protagonists in this story. We are there to support in every way we can, I think, the OAS and the international community, but they're the protagonists. They're the ones who are leading this process. And they're facing enormous, as you mentioned, repression, brutality, I would say. And that's, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has made important statements about the situation.
Calling it state terrorism.
That's right. And we had a permanent council meeting where they presented this, and member states made strong statements about this issue of state terrorism. So we need to keep up that kind of pressure and not surrender or give up simply because this is too hard or because we're not seeing immediate progress.
Catherine, I wanted to return to something you mentioned earlier, which is this increased role that the judicial branch is now playing in lots of elections around the world, and in the case of this conversation in Latin America. Venezuela is not a great case because there's not a reliable independent judiciary, and so the role of the Supreme Court didn't provide kind of a meaningful platform to debate what went on in the election. In other countries, it's a bit mixed. I think in Guatemala, there were great concerns as to how the judiciary would behave. In other places, the electoral institution itself has a separate institution that can arbitrate these kind of disputes. So my question is, can you tell us a little bit more of how the picture has changed? What happens after elections? Why does it seem like more of these disputes are finding their way to courts? And what role observers play in making sure that the courts handle this independently and with technical capacity?
Well, great question. And I think when we talk about the judicialization of elections, it immediately has sort of a negative connotation, but I don't believe that it needs to. So I do think in many countries the judiciary can and should serve as another check and another key independent institution that is protecting the electoral process. And I specifically say the process and not just the result, right? Because we are seeing increased litigation prior to an election, as well as potentially around the results process after election. And that's really important to look at both of those two things, because of course the judiciary can have a role in disputes around voter lists, around the exclusion of certain candidates, around saying that a law is unconstitutional when a certain reform has been passed. So a lot of this can disrupt an election, or be used as a means of systemic manipulation, as I talked about before, leading up to an election. So for that, I think observation, monitoring of that process, helping the public understand what's going on in the judiciary. That's often one of the key challenges. You have all of these cases coming ahead of the elections, but the public may not understand the impact of what that's having on the electoral process itself, and that comes back to that perceived legitimacy of the process. And then again, these disputes after the election. Again, I think we can't automatically assume that this is a negative thing. In many countries, the judiciary can actually serve as almost a safety valve, or at least a mechanism where people are utilising the rule of law to try and address a dispute versus violence and taking to the streets. However, the elephant in the room, of course, is the politicisation of the judiciary. And in many respects, that's no different to the challenges that we have with the politicisation of the election management bodies themselves that are managing the election. You're right, in Latin America, it's been interesting to see over the decades the development of these strong, robust electoral institutions, dedicated electoral tribunals, and well-resourced election management bodies. I've travelled around the world and often used some of these as models for other countries, and I think there's often a lot of envy at just how well they are resourced and their ability to be independent. But of course now we see that being eroded, and autocrats naturally are going to use all sorts of tactics to erode the credibility of the electoral process, but it will be to differing degrees. And that's where I think the Guatemala and the Venezuela examples are really interesting, because you do have differing degrees of interference and different degrees of systemic manipulation and fraud. And so I think it's very important to be able to identify those, break them down, and address them, including through observation and, again, specifically through recommendations. So IFAS did an electoral integrity assessment on Venezuela in 2019, so a number of years ago, but I think the key findings and the vulnerabilities that we found there very much were relevant and played out in this process. And the key ones included the highly politicized electoral institution, so that included the management, the CNE, and the judiciary, insecure voting results transmission, the disenfranchisement of millions of refugees under the current law at that time, rampant abuse of state resources and vote buying, and then lastly, of course, the repressive media and information environment. So I guess coming back to your prior question of like, what do we do? I really endorse what Ambassador Mora said about not giving in to being disheartened and hopelessness. I think naturally in this field, we must be tolerant of kind of risks and setbacks, and we need to look not just at the macro level, but the micro level of what's going on. And I think we pointed out some of the things that you did see, citizen observers who were there, you know, opposition who were trying to overcome certain barriers, disqualifications and other things to still be there. The unified response of the OAS and the international community making a statement about this. We need to continue that. We need to take the recommendations that have come out of this process and see where we are able to try and tackle the roots of some of these much deeper issues, which are kind of the foundation on which this electoral process played out.
Francisco, Catherine has mentioned several times a variety of factors that impact the quality and integrity of an election that are previous to the voting itself. I want to raise three of them and ask how the OAS and its electoral observation missions consider these factors when evaluating an election. One of them is the disqualification of candidates, which is, can happen for a variety of reasons with processes that are sometimes arbitrary, sometimes based in law. But certainly we saw it in Venezuela with 2 of the 3 unified opposition candidates. We saw it in Guatemala even before the shenanigans following the election itself. Another one is questions about term limits, which we saw as a question raised before the Salvadoran election last time, that some had thought tainted the entire process again before anyone had a chance to vote. And then questions of violence against candidates. And this was a huge concern in Mexico, where you had by all accounts, democratic and fair election, but with an astounding number of candidates who were either intimidated into not running or who were murdered during the electoral campaign at all level. I'm just wondering how you evaluate those factors before evaluating the election integrity itself when you finally get around to the voting.
Well, I think that's a very good question, because if you read our reports, you will see that the report at the end of the day is the story of the election. What happened before, why it happened before. Sometimes for Gerardo and the team is complicated because we have to say things that the state or the government feels that are too tough in ways, because we don't predetermine the rules of the game. That's predetermined by the state, by the country that is having that election. But this story about the election is important because, for example, you were mentioning the disqualification of candidates. Sometimes if you work hard enough not to have candidate A or candidate B in the ballot, you're winning the election. You're predetermining the result of the election. And we have seen that in Latin America a lot. That's why, and this is sometimes frustrating for us, we have recommended, let's say, for 2 or 3 times, you should change this and this and this, particularly on the legislative side of it. And some countries they say, okay, thank you for the recommendation, and that's it. There are no changes. So sometimes it's frustrating that. And particularly this issue that you're mentioning, I think is something that has proven to be problematic in many countries. In terms of term limits, that's always a problem. Each country has the possibility of determining by itself the rules of the game. But in the inter-American system, there are also criteria about how democratic it is to have, let's say, re-election as a human right. We know the answer to that. Re-election is not a human right as such. It's a possibility that is in the system, but we have been working very hard with the Venice Commission and other institutions in order to have a better criteria. And violence, I wouldn't say that is an elephant in the room. There are like 500 elephants in the room in many countries in Latin America. Mm-hmm. For the first time, that was the case of Ecuador. We had to, our observers, they had to wear a security vest, bulletproof vest. That when Gerardo was on the ground, and when he called me and he explained to me that it had to be done, this is something that we were not used to it. So nowadays, for example, Benjamin, and this is interesting, we have been developing new methodologies in terms of how to deal with violence and how to deal with security, which is complicated because we were referring to the lack of financing for the missions. If the missions are already very complex, imagine if you add the security issue into the equation. So it becomes more and more and more complicated. And in terms of the integrity of the process and to determine if the election was, let's say the election was okay, we can say it was democratic. I think that since the internet era is having more and more impact on the narrative of the elections, going back to Venezuela, even if we were not in the ground, we knew what was happening. And if you read Gerardo's report on what happened during that election, you will see an examination of all these topics. And many of these topics are part of the new reality that we're facing. To be honest, since I've been involved in elections for 40 years, the elections from 40 years ago up to the elections that we have to see now, they are so different in so many ways, particularly because polarization is becoming, let's say, a very disturbing force in terms of producing violence. If the political speech between candidates is violent in itself, you can expect that violence is going to turn out in the streets. And that's what we're seeing in many countries. Political assassinations in particular is something that worries us a lot. I won't refer to Mexico because Gerardo and myself are Mexicans. We didn't go to the Electoral Observation Mission because of neutrality. We didn't participate. But in other countries, of course, you can include Mexico in those countries, this development of more violence in the electoral processes is something very concerning. Because unfortunately, it's not only election day, it's the prior events that happened to the election, and then the post-electoral trauma that we're seeing in many countries. That's why I think for the future, it won't be during my period or Almagro's period, but for the future, I think that the programs have to evolve more, not only to electoral observation in itself, but also to the political mediation and the help that so many countries need in order to go through the political process, which is becoming more violent, more complicated, and even politicians who arrive to power through democratic means, when they are in power, they are trying to put obstacles to the political procedure. And just finishing with this part of the judges and the administrative institutions. Generally, we think of elections of being organized by the electoral institution, but we don't think enough about the possibility of the judges deciding an election and the power that the judges have in deciding that election. And we focus very much our observation on the administrative side of the election day, but not enough on the further steps. And I think that for the future, that's something that has to be considered, because in many countries, the polarization and the political division is so strong that after 2 or 3 months that the election just happened, you still have political conflict, because it's in the hand of the electoral judges to determine. When you have electoral judges, there are some countries in which you don't even have the specialty of an electoral judge, and it's the Supreme Court or other bodies who are in charge of that. So I think these trends for the future, it's something I keep telling Gerardo when he comes to me and we discuss the plans for the year. We always consider what sort of risks we're going to have, not only on the administrative side, on the technical side, but also on what sort of decisions the judges are going to take. And I think that the Guatemalan experience was, in that sense, it was a bit crazy, you know, because you had the split was 20-something points, and you still were praying to God that finally Mr. Arévalo could become the president, because that's related to the role of judges, which is something that I think has to be studied more in the future.
Ambassador Mora, in the interest in improving these systems and the important role of electoral observation, I wonder if you might respond to 2 of the weaknesses that have been raised today. One of them is this question of when the international attention turns to an election. I think what we heard from Catherine is that, you know, the attention and funding often come very late in the process. Naturally, you know, someone like you has a full plate, and so sometimes it's hard to turn to an issue that's 6 months or even a year in the future. But I think we've heard effectively articulated how important it is for these processes to start and the funding to flow well in advance. And then on the flip side, which is the recommendations themselves and the follow-up, and what efforts there are structurally to make sure that attention remains on an election even when the election has concluded, that these recommendations that are generated by the OAS, by IFES, and others are actually taken seriously and potentially implemented.
So I'm going to take advantage of your question because it's related, to mention something that I think we're seeing a lot more. And that is the arguments for sovereignty and non-intervention, right? There's always quite a bit of pushback, and the argument is often made that, well, we can't interfere in the internal affairs, right? You have to respect sovereignty and all the rest, and it's in the charter of the OAS, et cetera. And so to be able to do electoral observations, one, you need the permission of the government, but everything else you do subsequent requires the political will of the government to implement the recommendations and to do all the necessary work prior to the election. And unless we are invited to do so, unless someone at the OAS or a member state says we need to do X, we don't get involved. Why? Because the issue of sovereignty comes up. We have a group, a voluntary group on the strengthening of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, right? An incredibly important tool that the OAS has to defend and to promote democracy in the region. The charter is now 23 years old, and when it was first established, of course, the threats to democracy were different than those today. Then, or it was either military coup or a self-coup, as we saw in some places in the 1990s. But no one envisioned these kinds of threats that we're seeing today. And so people are saying, is the charter outdated? Does the charter needs, updating? Well, the idea of opening and renegotiating the charter in an environment of depolarization is challenging. But we're doing some work in finding ways of identifying what are the threats to democracy that we didn't think of back in 2001. And we're working and having workshops and meetings and thinking about what the OAS can do more in those areas. And I think that's an important progress that we're doing here. But, as I often say to my colleagues, I say, listen, absolutely we have to respect sovereignty and non-interference. But every time you sign an agreement, whether it's the Inter-American Democratic Charter or a free trade agreement, you're ceding sovereignty, right? And you're ceding sovereignty because there's a greater benefit in all this, right? And so if we're going to live by the charter, if we're going to defend the Inter-American Democratic Charter, I'm not saying that we need to give up on sovereignty or that we need to reconceptualize sovereignty, although some people have talked about that. But we have to make sure that authoritarian governments don't hide behind it to protect themselves against those who are advocating and wanting to promote and defend democracy and human rights in the hemisphere.
Well, maybe you could be specific in terms of some of the adjustments, the reforms, the amendments to the charter that you're envisioning as they relate to potentially the management of elections, the presence of neutral third-party observers. Has that entered into these conversations at all?
Yes, but carefully. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I'll give you one example, the issue of disinformation and misinformation. That's, without a doubt, an important, significant challenge to democracy in the region. So the group is doing a lot of work in workshops, and we're going to try highlighting that at General Assembly meetings, I think. There are areas on political campaign financing that we're interested in doing. That's an area that I think deserves some work. Now, are we going to insert this into the charter? I don't see that in the short term. But if we can continue calling attention and making sure that the OAS is, up to speed on these issues, that we're not living in 2001, we're living in 2024, 2025, and that if we want to actually defend and promote democracy, we need to have an understanding of what those threats are and be able to respond to those democracies in 2024. So, again, the charter is relevant, it's valid, it's important, perhaps more important than it has been since 2001. But we have to think creatively about and be consistent about when we talk about defending democracy and what those particular challenges are.
Francisco, is there anything that the Western Hemisphere, that the OAS could learn from other multilateral institutions at a regional level when it comes to electoral observation? Ambassador Moore didn't seem optimistic that it would be an easy path to reforming the Inter-American Democratic Charter or to requiring electoral observation. But as far as I understand, in other regions, that is a norm.
Well, let's say that the best example that I think that we can compare in one way or another is what's happening in the European Union. Mm-hmm. Because they have democratic principles that are part of the interactions that they have, and of course they have a very strong electoral observation program. Actually, the European Union is, as you know, in Guatemala, they were part of that beautiful prize that we got from the Wilson Center. I think we have many similarities in many ways, not the same resources, as I was complaining, but we have the same principles and the same objectives. Not the same in other regions, There are international organizations who are working very hard in Asia and Africa. But I think that the case of what we do in America, in the Americas, it's something that it's quite unique. And it's the political compromise that the countries assume when they are part of the OAS is something that we hadn't seen in other parts of the world. The case of Europe is different because of historical tradition and the development of you have all democracies in that part of the world, but you don't see that much, for example, in Asia, or in the case of Africa, I think it's more the international organizations rather than the African Union who are working on that. But nevertheless, I have to say that particularly DECO, we always exchange experiences with them because we belong to the Declaration of Principles organization, which we share all the principles and the technique and the methodologies that we work on. But the case of the Democratic Charter of the OAS, I think is a matter of pride. What I would like to see, and this is something that I can say at this moment, is that this commitment continues in the future. Because as we have seen, it's very easy to lose democracy. You can have a country that seems very democratic, but that because of this decline that you can see, this landsliding that we talk a lot, you can see it in some countries in Latin America. I won't mention names, but you can imagine which countries I'm talking about, in which you see that some people get to power, they stay in power, and then they want to change the rules. And they want to change the rules for the benefit of their political party or because they are thinking of staying in power for a long, long time. And that political commitment, I think, is going to be extremely relevant for the future for one reason. I keep thinking that particularly the DECO program, which is part of the programs that we have at the Secretariat, of course, the special missions like the one that Frank mentioned in Guatemala, the DECO program should be something that is strategic for the future of the organization. Because thanks to the neutrality and the technical capabilities that we develop, is that we can declare that in a country with which the left is governing or the right or the center, it doesn't matter because of ideological reasons, we act the same way. So in the future, I would be expecting for the next Secretary General that whoever is elected embraces this program and helps the program to develop more. When I refer and cry a little bit about money, I'm not doing that just because I'm greedy, I want to have tons of millions of dollars. No, it's because elections are becoming more and more and more complicated. And as Frank mentioned, the follow-up particularly of artificial intelligence and the internet and the impact of the social platforms is so huge, Benjamin, that, for example, deepfake, which is something that we know is very much part of artificial intelligence. What are we going to do about it? For example, during the silence periods, there's this figure in Mexico, we call it la veda. During the veda period, when this silence period that goes from Wednesday to Sunday, in the good old days when I was an electoral counselor, you didn't have the internet as such. Nowadays, with deep fakes, it's almost impossible to control it. And if the election is very close, let's say the election has a 1% or 2% difference, just the very existence of artificial intelligence can change the result of the election. And that has a definite impact on what's happening. So we need more tools. Gerardo, for example, and the DECO team is working, how do we get more tools in order to have more reports on what's happening on political violence, on artificial intelligence, on the technical issues, who sometimes are not part of the political discussion, but they have a huge impact on the final result. So we can learn from other regions, and we do, but the Latin American way in which we work, of course, I would have to say I would be very glad. It would be fantastic to have more work also in the Caribbean region. Mm-hmm. We observe in the Caribbean region, but I would love to have even more resources and more work into the Caribbean, since sometimes they have a very different political system, the parliamentary system, and they work in a different way. But I'm just trying to lay out things for the future, because I think we all together have to recognize that electoral observation has become, let's say that if you don't have electoral observation, international electoral observation in your election, I think it's going to be complicated that you sell to the world that your election it was a true and real and fair election. You need observers from outside in order to prove that you don't have anything to hide, and that's part of the problem in some countries.
Catherine, same question for you. You and IFES work all around the world. What is superior? What is working as a model in the Americas, and what maybe in terms of rules, norms, funding mechanisms, timelines might be imported into the Americas from other regions that perhaps have best practices?
Sure. Great question. And as I was listening, I was just reflecting on political will and the fact that it's absolutely true. Everywhere we work, this region, it's no different, that political will is necessary for reforms in this area. And as I was thinking about that, I was pondering how you influence political will. And I think what we've been talking about here are different layers of relationships and different kind of types of influence that you can have. And I think when I think about IFAS, sort of our approach to working with some of these independent institutions to try and shore up that institution, make sure that they can reinforce the integrity of the electoral process, our role is purely technical, coming in, providing technical options, solutions, comparative examples from the region or around the world. And that's a way, I think, to build confidence with an institution and build that relationship. If we were to go in without that impartiality, without that technical approach, I think we would fail in terms of being able to make any sort of leeway in that area. But that's one layer. And then on top of that, you layer these observation missions. And again, very impartial, but coming in and assessing the electoral process against agreed and well-known international and regional standards and the value of that, and making that assessment, which is different to IFAS being in there, appreciating the sovereignty, but giving the institutions options of how they can improve. And then, of course, you've got a layer on top of that of international community and different types of political pressure that you might utilize, whether sanctions, joint statements, and pressure. And it's almost that sandwich or Big Mac, if you put together, that I think's the way to be influencing that political will. And it's no different in any region. As I said earlier, it plays out differently in different countries. So it is incredibly important to be doing the type of assessment and analysis that IFAS does, that the OAS does, to be able to tackle the problem at those different levels. One thing I will say that the region has actually been quite advanced on, and that we've utilized as a model elsewhere, is, and the OAS has been a key part of this, is developing communities of election management bodies and electoral judges or tribunals, and using those communities to go and observe or have visitor programs in other countries. And that's, I think, incredibly innovative. It's something that we have now replicated in Africa and Europe, Eurasia, particularly as it pertains to these judges, because you will find a judge will tend to not necessarily be interested in engaging in with other stakeholders or interlocutors, but in terms of peers, there's a willingness there to sort of hear how different courts are dealing with similar challenges, and the opportunity to go and see that play out in another country. You just might have an impact on these judges when they are in their own country and facing these own political pressures, how they decide on these cases. So I would say that's something that Latin America has led on, and it is something that I really hope doesn't erode. It has financial implications like anything else does, but certainly a key model that I would hope to see strengthen in the region.
I should have mentioned this earlier, but for anyone here who wants Spanish interpretation, and we do have equipment in the hallway, and for those of you watching online, you've always had the opportunity to listen to this in Spanish. Hopefully anyone who did found their way to that interpretation well before I reminded you of it. Another reminder is that we have a lot of expertise in the room here, and so if anyone has a question, please indicate that to me, and I think we have a microphone, and you're welcome to ask that now or in the remaining time. Okay, while you form your questions, let me ask Ambassador Mora one more of my own, and then we'll get to some of your questions and observations in the audience here at the Wilson Center. The missions of observation, as you said, require the approval of the governments themselves. Ultimately, there's no getting around that unless there's some kind of legal obligation imposed through a treaty, through the OAS Charter. But there's norms and there's pressure, and there's a role that the international community can play in setting standards for elections, again, even if they're not binding. I wonder if you think in all cases, or in the cases that perhaps where observation matters most, there's sufficient pressure from peers in the region, meaning is this prioritized in the engagement of governments, either collectively at the OAS or individually at the State Department and our mission to the OAS? Do we prioritize enough nudging, the outliers, Argentina, Uruguay, countries like Venezuela, that are not participating yet in electoral observation, or is some other kind of diplomacy necessary to change the norms in the region?
I don't think there's pressure, but there is shame, right? The work that the DECO does has such legitimacy, right? It's, as I said, the gold standard that if you feel, right, that you need to have a government that's elected and that you as president or candidate want to be viewed as legitimate, well, the first thing you need is an electoral observation mission. And there's, of course, one here in the Western Hemisphere. And if you don't get it, then people start sneering and looking at you and thinking, something's wrong here, right? And that doesn't come from any pressure. It's just guilt, good old guilt and shame. And we should use that guilt and shame. But no, to answer your question directly, there isn't anything specific where we're going to tell the Uruguayans, we're going to pressure the Uruguayans to accept electoral observation. No, and I don't think it's necessary, quite frankly. Not yet, anyways. With the way the democracy is going and how they're trying to create doubt and cynicism about institutions, including electoral observation missions, we might have to do that. But I want to go back and end with something that Francisco said. We must defend, we must support this institution, right? If we lose this, or if we allow the authoritarians in the region to delegitimize, as we've seen in a couple of examples, by the way, I won't mention the examples, where there was an effort to say, this is not a serious process, this is not a serious process, there are technical problems here and there. We cannot accept that. The United States will not allow for any member state, without a response from the United States, to criticize this process. As long as it's run the way it's run now, as long as it's impartial, professional, capable, technical, we will stand up and defend this electoral observation mission, because if we don't have free and fair election and viewed as such, we don't have democracy, period.
And I don't want to pick on Uruguay. We did raise Uruguay. There's no concerns that I'm aware of about the quality of the election that Uruguay will be holding next month. Just and as an example that came up of countries that aren't routinely participating. No, that's an important point that you raised. I think you were alluding to the last election in Bolivia involving Evo Morales. I won't put you on the spot to confirm. But there have been moments where the OAS and electoral observers themselves have become victims of broader political polarization. And those have resulted in attacks on the technical capabilities of electoral observation missions that are not helpful in creating a norm and an expectation that everything will be observed and should be, whether or not there are particular concerns. Maybe before we conclude, I could ask you, Catherine, and you, Francisco, to address that issue of how electoral observers and how these important institutions remain above the fray and remain seen by all parties of all political ideologies as credible, neutral, technically capable actors who can play an important role.
Well, I think Francisco mentioned earlier the community around the Declaration of Principles for International Observation, and I think those principles are critical. And of course, the foundation, I think, for protecting the reputation and the credibility of these missions is ensuring that they are conducted in adherence to those principles, and again be seen as such, coming back to the idea of perceptions. So I think that's the key thing. And then as Ambassador Mora said, that political backing of the missions themselves and the reports that are coming out, which otherwise can be neglected, put on a shelf, kind of discredited. I think the importance, again, of having that other layer of the sandwich, being able to look at this and sort of reinforce what's being done by those missions, I say would be the sort of two key things I would focus on.
Yeah, just to say, just to say that Canada, Uruguay, Argentina, and those countries who do not participate in general, they are consolidated democracies. The case of Uruguay, not because my boss is Uruguayan, but if he's listening, I want just to say on the record that Uruguay is, with Costa Rica, are let's say that the strongest democracies that we have, and that's good. But nevertheless, it will always be good to have electoral observation, even if your country is. Costa Rica has electoral observation, yeah. The thing about the future and the dangers that I see for observers, and I'm saying this because I used to be, when I was an electoral counselor, I participated with Uniore, which is a regional organization of electoral authorities who comprises administrative and judges. We used to work, I used to be an observer there, and they are doing a great job in also improving the capabilities of electoral institutions. But the electoral observation, the independent electoral observation that we carry out is something different. Why? Because of the funding, because of this neutrality and institutionality that we have in order to work to get good elections. But we're seeing a phenomena that Gerardo's team has been tackling also, that is the fake observers. And I want to mention the fake observers because it's like a copycat program, but a bad copycat program, in a way that some regimes are very much interested in building or trying to construct the view or the image that they had in electoral observation. But they invite political parties, they pay for the observation, and everybody knows that those guys are not neutral and are not independent. And this is a phenomenon that doesn't belong only to the Americas. You can see that happens a lot in Africa, that happens a lot in Asia, and then you can say, no, yes, of course, we had a mission. Yeah, but you invited all your buddies, all your friends. That's not observation. Electoral observation has rules, has principles, and I think that that's something that we have to work more into the future. I just want to mention that every year we have a meeting for electoral authorities. We invite all the electoral institutions. We invite all the judiciary judges who are involved into elections. And this annual meeting is becoming more and more and more important because it's among peers. We are the secretariat for the meeting, the technical secretariat for the meeting. Gerardo and his team, they have that role. But it's very important, Benjamin, to point out that now the electoral community in the Americas, they know the value of electoral observation. And they know that if they don't have electoral observation in their processes, they're going to suffer a credibility problem, which is always one part of what they're trying to avoid. And finally, to say that you can see it clearly. Opposition parties in every country are the most interested parties that want to have us there. Sometimes, some of them were government, then they lost the government and they are opposition now. But there's always this call for let's have electoral observation because it's good for the system. It's good for the credibility of elections. And I think this is one of these figures that is going to remain for many, many years because now this observation is becoming more technical, more complicated, but because of that we need to strengthen the capabilities and the numbers of observers. We would love to have more observers if we could. Gerardo does as much as he can with the resources that he gets. But nowadays, with other topics that are arising, like the ones that I mentioned about artificial intelligence, the internet, and so many other things, I think it's becoming more and more important to have better teams. And I think we're working on that, and the political support that I always thank Frank and the US and the Canadians and other European countries who help us out. Because there's another phenomenon, I just want to mention it, that is worrying. Sometimes we're getting more funding from countries outside the region, from the very countries that are in the region. I'm not mentioning, of course, Canada and the US, but other countries. We need those countries, the big democracies of the continent, they need to engage more, and they need to invest into electoral observation because it's the best way to prevent democratic erosion in the region.
Yeah, and often, and I hope you'd agree, Ambassador Moore, the costs in diplomatic energy of dealing with an election that goes wrong are quite a bit higher than in assuring that it goes smoothly and assuring adequate observation. This has been terrific. I really appreciate all your time and insights. Ambassador Mora, Catherine, Francisco, this was terrific. For those of you who are interested in issues of the strength of democracy in the Americas and the challenges it faces, as I said, we have a broader initiative on these issues that we call Restoring Confidence in Elections in Latin America. It will address not only electoral observation, but electoral technologies, the design and independence of electoral institutions, how disputes are adjudicated and whether electoral judges and tribunals are a good solution, campaign finance, and other issues related to technology. So please continue to follow our work at the Wilson Center on these issues, and please join me in thanking our special guest today.